Welcome back to Face the Nation. Joining us now to help us educate our viewers about new COVID-19 developments is former FDA Commissioner Dr. Scott Gottlieb. He joins us from his home in Connecticut. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
I'm wondering, we heard from Dr. Birx, and then we heard from the governor of Massachusetts. I know you've also been advising him. There's a lot of concern about Boston and Chicago, Birx said. What are the other areas of the country that you still see as very worrisome?
Well, I think when you look at the Southeast and the Sun Belt, you still need to be worried. You haven't seen cases really spike in Texas or Georgia. In fact, it looks like cases are slowing there. But there's parts of those states that are hotspots, counties that are moving very quickly. Parts of the Panhandle in Florida, you see cases growing very quickly. So the parts of the country that were later to enter their epidemic portion of this crisis, I think still are going to come out of it later, and you still have to be concerned about that. And in really any part of the country is vulnerable, even rural parts of the country. We saw that with South Dakota. Once a case gets into a situation where you have people tightly packed indoors, it can spread very quickly. You see these super spreader situations as you saw in South Dakota. So I don't think anyone's out of the woods right now.
But you are seeing some governors start talking about and opening up things like beaches in Florida, parts of that state. You heard Dr. Birx say that there is, in fact, a national strategy for testing. Do you think that strategy is adequate?
Well, look, I think it's a loose strategy. I think states are largely on their own trying to get testing resources into their states. And I think one of the things they should be doing right now is trying to work together, at least on a regional basis, to move around samples to take advantage of capacity for testing that exists in a regional location within the country. Where we need a national strategy, first and foremost, is on the testing supply chain. So all the cheap, low commodity components that go into testing, like the swabs and the reagents, and we've been talking about this for weeks now, those are all in short supply. We don't have shortages of them, but whatever gets produced is getting consumed because it's a global supply chain that testing sites are tugging on. And so if you had the government more engaged in trying to manage that supply chain, getting supplies to the states that need it most, and trying to look for ways to increase manufacturing at a national level, that could help the states get the supplies they need. It's not the testing platforms per se that are in short supply. A lot of states have testing capacity within the states. It's the components to run those tests that they're having trouble getting their hands on.
Well, and Dr. Birx said that there is an attempt to try to help the states. What's missing there? What kind of coordination does there need to be between states and labs and the federal government?
Well, I think the federal government has more capacity to try to tug on that global supply chain, get more supplies into the country while other countries are competing for the same supplies, and also look at how we ramp up manufacturing of these components. These are low commodity components. There are a lot of plastic parts that could be 3D printed. There might be ways to increase manufacturing in the United States. It's something that we should be looking at trying to do if we can bring on manufacturing sites that can make some of these things here domestically, both in the near term and the long term. Right now, the swing capacity in the market, if we're going to see dramatic increases in capacity coming into the market in May and June, it's going to be from new systems coming into the market, the point-of-care diagnostic systems like the Abbott machine that we've seen or the Cepheid Gene Expert. Those companies are probably going to increase their supply of the machines that they have available, and there's a couple of other companies awaiting approval with the FDA or authorization to come into the market, and that will probably be the inflection point if we're likely to see one, at least in May and June.
You said employers should look at things like on-site testing before their employees return to work. Do you think that's something that governors should mandate companies to have? What corporation is going to spend the money unless they're required to do so?
Right. I don't think it should be a mandate because there's a lot of corporations that are going to have difficulty bringing this on site. I think where the government can play a role is helping to subsidize these activities in the near term so that we can make sure it's available not just to white-collar jobs in offices, but also shop floors and factories where there's actually more risk to employees because they can't naturally social distance, or helping small businesses come together and put machines in local communities because they're going to have a hard time doing this. You're going to see a lot of office-based jobs actually bring testing on site. I'm talking to a lot of companies that are actively working on this right now. And you're going to see provider groups step in to provide those facilities to companies. And what I worry about is it's not going to be available to all employees, and employees who are most at risk of contracting COVID at work because they can't naturally social distance are the ones who aren't going to have access to these facilities. And so I think states have a role to play in helping to democratize these kinds of technologies so that more employees can take advantage of them.
And does that mean expanding the health care requirement, the paid leave policies that expire under current legislation in December?
Yeah, look, I have a letter I'm working on with a bunch of public health officials, a bipartisan group, making recommendations to Congress to look at ways to provide paid sick leave to people who have diagnosed COVID so that they can self-isolate at home, as well as provide money to people who are self-isolating at home awaiting a test result. You don't want getting a positive COVID-19 test result to be punitive. You don't want to tell people they have to self-isolate at home and, oh, by the way, they're going to lose wages and they're going to incur other expenses and hardship. So while you don't want to make it something that's a financial inducement to get coronavirus, you also don't want to make it punitive. And we have to balance that. We have to find that happy medium. And that means, I think, providing for lost wages and maybe providing a stipend, a small stipend to people, similar to what we do when they serve on jury duty, because there are costs that people are going to incur by self-isolating at home if they have a coronavirus illness. And as a society, we're going to want them to do that. That's how we're going to stop the spread.
And very quickly, how close are we to some kind of treatment or vaccine, and is China going to beat us there?
There's a risk that China may get to a vaccine first. I don't think their adenoviral vector vaccine is very good, but they may get it to the market before we do. I think that is a concern. In terms of the vaccine here in the United States, we may have hundreds of thousands of doses available in the fall for testing. And if there is an outbreak, a big outbreak in an American city, I think it would be made available in the city under some kind of protocol. So we would have it available in the setting of an outbreak. Certainly not a national epidemic like we have right now. We may have one or more treatments by the fall. I don't think anyone's going to be a home run, but we may have something that can help.
Dr. Gottlieb, thank you very much, as always, for your insight.
Thanks a lot.
We'll be right back with a look at the financial fallout from the coronavirus crisis. We turn now to the economy and the continued financial fallout from the coronavirus. Suzanne Clark is the president of the Chamber of Commerce based here in Washington. Good morning.
Good morning.
The volume, the amount of demand that small businesses had for emergency aid was so great that that $350 billion fund ran out on Thursday. We know from congressional leaders and the Treasury that they expect some kind of deal to replenish those funds. Is $250 billion enough?
Well, we know that the small businesses out there are really hurting, and every hour and day that goes by without this assistance is really hurting them. And so we know that it's a really good start. And it's part of why we're working on a path forward on how you reopen businesses so that they can get back in some kind of gradual, phased-in way to work.
So you do believe this $250 billion package will be approved this week, but I mean, a senior Fed official I spoke to this week said even the 250 on top of the 350 billion may not be enough because small businesses are in such acute pain and they make up such an important part of the U.S. economy. I mean, what's the timeline?
I think the $250 billion is just another really important step on getting aid to the front lines as fast as possible. I do think it will get done this week, and the Chamber is delighted about that. What we really believe, though, to your point, is that these businesses and getting paychecks in the hands of Americans at some point requires getting back to work, of course, safely and sustainably when the public health officials say it's okay to do so.
But when it comes to your members, how many of them had a hard time getting access to this money? Because CBS, in our reporting at this network, has found that many of the smaller businesses didn't get their applications through.
We know that there was great demand because we know that there's great pain out there. We know that the banks, this didn't make different banking regulations go away. So they had to deal with people they knew did business with. They had to deal with anti-money laundering rules, et cetera. So it was easier to do business with people that they knew. But we know now, as other non-traditional lenders get into the space, that they are ready to give the money and make it easier for small businesses to access as soon as that fund is replenished.
So you expect it to function better this time?
Yes.
The Chamber released a poll showing at the beginning of April that 1 out of 10 members say they are less than 1 month away from permanently going out of business. What are your projections on bankruptcies and closures?
It's really terrifying, these numbers. You had something like 50% of small businesses say that they were 8 weeks away from closing forever. And so that's why these bridge programs are so important, but also why it's so important that we start to think about reopening in a gradual, phased-in way. We know that certain regions were hit harder than others, but we also know that there were certain regions that weren't hit as hard. We know that certain sectors, as Dr. Gottlieb just said, will have a harder time coming back, but there are other sectors that may be able to open. open. So the faster that we can get people back to work, we know what this job means to a community and to a family, and the faster we can get paychecks into their hands and get these businesses to open, the sharper and faster the recovery will be.
What is the cost to a small business owner of trying to provide, and what is the legal expectation for that small business owner to try to provide testing or protective equipment to their employees? Are you telling businesses to go ask their governors and mayors, or is that the business owner's job?
That's exactly where we're doing our work. So the Chamber's Path Forward is all about gathering all of the questions and concerns that small, medium, and large businesses across the country have, and helping develop a framework for policymakers and businesses so that when we get the yellow light, the proceed with caution light to reopen, they're ready. And you're right that that's part tracing and testing, but it's also part which equipment and how do you train, and then there's the best practices and guidelines. Are we asking employers to check whether you've been tested? Are we creating some kind of immune registry? There are a lot of regulatory and legal questions here that small business owners and big business owners want to know. There's no playbook for this. It's unprecedented, and they want to know if they take a risk in an imperfect information situation that they're going to be protected.
And who is answering those questions? Is that the federal government?
It's really a coordinated approach. You have federal guidelines that then have to be implemented on a state and local level because the conditions vary so much by zip code.
All right. Well, very quickly before we leave, can I get you to clarify, do you expect the requirement to provide health care coverage, paid leave, to happen because it currently expires in December?
I don't know what the Congress will end up deciding. What I expect is that companies and communities are going to do the right thing by their people. We don't want sick people in the workplace. We can't get back to work until we get back to health. And I expect that the government and business will work together to figure that out.
A lot of big questions still unanswered. Thank you very much, Suzanne Clark.
Thank you.
We will be back in a moment. Of the populations most vulnerable to a COVID-19 outbreak, the world's 26 million refugees are at the top of that list. They often live in close quarters with access to only basic health and sanitation facilities. An outbreak of the virus could be devastating. The country of Jordan is home to at least 3.5 million refugees and also the world's largest Syrian refugee camp. We are joined now by the King of Jordan, His Majesty, King Abdullah II. Good morning to you, Your Majesty.
Good morning, Margaret.
Social distancing is next to impossible for refugees. How do you plan to limit the spread?
Well, we acted quite early on, and that helped us flatten the curve quite well, and we created obviously some tough measures in lockdown and quarantines that are over the whole country, although we're in the process of opening that up slightly. The challenge with refugees, obviously they're about 20% of our population. The majority are not in refugee camps, so that is a challenge, but we treat every person inside of our borders, whether you're a Jordanian citizen or a refugee, in the same manner. Excessive testing has helped us figure out what our challenges are, but definitely a country with a 20% increase of its population through refugees, it's a major challenge as we go into the future.
So given that not all refugees live in camps, what kind of sense do you have of the degree to which the virus has penetrated that community?
Well, again, we do random and targeted testing throughout the whole country. Refugee camps, because obviously people are much closer together in living conditions, was something that we looked at earlier on. So there is a lot of testing. The lockdown on the quarantine has helped Jordan sort of flatten the curve quite quickly. The cases that we've had over the past week are under 10 people every day. We average 15, give or take, on a weekly basis. So it seems that we've got things under control and within the capabilities of our medical and health establishments. But again, there's always that question out there, is there a gap in society that you don't know of? And so, again, testing at a massive scale is how we're relying on hopefully getting the right figures.
This pandemic is global, and the UN has called for a global response, but frankly, Europe is struggling with this virus. The United States is. The U.S. president just cut funding, or froze it at least, to the World Health Organization. Who do you see actually leading a global response?
Well, I think this is a challenge that took everybody by surprise by the impact and the magnitude of this pandemic. And I think the question is, nobody is going to get a perfect score on this issue. Each country has different ways of handling it, nuances of their societies and what their country faces. The question that I think you're alluding to is, where are we 4 months, 6 months, a year from now? Do we understand that this is a new world that we're living in? This is a disease, a virus that crosses borders. It's an invisible enemy. It'll target developed countries, undeveloped countries, whatever your religion, creed, color, or race. Unless we work together, we will not be able to overcome this in the way that we need to. So our enemies of yesterday, or those that were not friendly countries yesterday, whether we like it or not, are our partners today. And I think the quicker we as leaders and politicians figure that out, the quicker we can bring this under control, because it's not just COVID-19 that we're worried about, is what does it bring for us on the world in 2021, 22, 23? Are we going to be prepared for the next wave of this? And that can only happen if we reach out to each other.
Well, the IMF has said that if countries don't handle this right, that the virus could destabilize countries, in particular because of the economic strain. Are you worried about instability in Jordan? Are you worried that this could be exploited by extremist groups?
Well, I think all over the world, extremist groups and the usual suspects will obviously try and take advantage of that. We, as a country that have come out of the regional shocks of wars with the massive surge of refugees that we've had, plus being a poor country on a very strict program with the IMF in trying to get the economy back and running, obviously this is a major concern. Having said that, we have seen areas of our society where actually we can be supporters for the region, but it's, I think, a challenge that all countries are facing of whether or not we get the economics right. So here's the risk. I mean, obviously we are now slowly, gradually opening up, understanding that it could really move us back a couple of paces. But I think with this type of challenge, we've got to be very light on our feet. So mistakes, I keep saying, that are made yesterday, as long as we get them right today, and keep our institutions and our people flexible enough to be able to take on the challenges that we may not have foreseen tomorrow.
Have you spoken to the president of China or asked him for help?
No, I have not. I have been in touch with leaders around the world. At the beginning, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, the leader and my dear friend in the United Arab Emirates, he got in touch with me and asked what could he do to help. And again, we had a problem with test kits. Jack Ma of Alibaba gave us 100,000 test kits that almost tripled our capability overnight. Many individuals and countries have helped us, as we have in turn been helping them. And this is, I think, the flavor I hope that people will get. I mean, to be really honest, Mother Nature gave us a big kick up the backside. And are we smart enough as a race and as a people to understand that we've got to get it right? And do we now serve humanity in the right way to be able to make sure that everybody is looked after? Because those that have not are going to suffer as much as those that have. And if we don't reach out to those that are in need, even though we may have limited resources, it is, at this stage, doing what's right to help all of us, because we're all in the same boat.
Your Majesty, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Margaret.
We'll be right back. Finally today, with the nation's governors becoming familiar faces to all of us, regardless of where we live, thanks to technology, we asked 60 Minutes correspondent John Dickerson for his thoughts on the crucial role they're playing in this crisis.
While the medical laboratories search for a coronavirus cure, the laboratories of democracy are also hard at work. That's the phrase Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis used to describe the 50 American states. The political scientists in these laboratories are the governors, facing the toughest issues of the virus, from overburdened hospitals and equipment shortages.
Our first responders, our healthcare workers, everybody deserves to have that gear. And I'm telling you, we're killing ourselves trying to make it happen.
to exploding unemployment.
Our economic condition is uncertain, but the state of our character has never been stronger.
In their response, they have reminded us what leadership looks like, where its limits are, and how generously citizens respond to grace under pressure. In a crisis when there is no end date, people crave specificity and plain speaking, even if it's tough medicine.
What's the penalty for a young person going out to a restaurant or hanging in a social get-together? And it's true, the penalty is you might kill your grandparent.
Voters in a state may know their governor, but usually the rest of the country only tunes in when a disaster hits. Then the governor is the one in the windbreaker standing behind the president surveying the damage. Now governors are center stage because the disaster in one state is the disaster facing every state.
All these patients here.
When governors remind their constituents, they also remind the country that we are all connected.
We have to pull together, and ultimately it's going to be these small acts, what seems small, of each and every American that truly is going to make all the difference in the world.
In an age of finger-pointing, blame-shifting, and spin, it can be bracing to simply hear a leader take responsibility.
If you are upset by what we have done, be upset at me. My judgment is do whatever is necessary to contain this virus, and then we will manage the consequences afterwards. The old expression, the buck stops on my desk, the buck stops on my desk. Your local mayor did not close your restaurants, your bars, your gyms, or your schools. I did.
Voters notice when leaders step up. Polls show that the governors in the states of California, New York, Ohio, and Arkansas have approval ratings in the 70s and 80s. State laboratories also show the limits of what works. In Michigan, Governor Whitmer has rallied the public and won its approval, but recent strict stay-at-home orders caused a backlash, which in its responsible form reminded us that leaders can only do so much through coercion. Leaders identify a need, make a plan, and follow through. So this week, 3 sets of regional governors formed groups to think through the next phase in COVID-19 response that might boost economic output, relying on evidence, consultation, and persuasion. There's much work ahead, because even when the medical laboratories find a solution, these laboratories will have to keep working.
And we'll keep working too. That's it for us today. Thank you for watching. Until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.